My name is Michael Carpenter. I do research for Borders and Globalization here at the University of Victoria, housed at the Centre for Global Studies on Canada's West Coast. As we use this space, we like to remind ourselves and others that these lands are the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin and Algonquin-speaking peoples, including the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich, whose historical relationships with the land continue today. I want to thank Borders and Globalization Research Network for making this possible, especially the team here, Emmanuel, Edwin, Nicole, and Ben. And I want to thank everyone else for being with us in the room and folks joining us online, maybe some people from some other countries. So perhaps a little bit of border erasure happening right here in this space right now. I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody and getting some feedback from you, especially in the second hour. But if you do have a question in the meantime, don't hesitate to jump in. This presentation won't be so good that you can't interrupt as we go. So I want to just put on the screen an overview or a map of what I would like to discuss today. And I would like to start with the context of rising global challenges of irregular migration. So we'll define what that is, we'll look at some numbers, and we'll look at a few examples very quickly. And then we're going to turn to the social sciences. What does the research say? So we're going to look very briefly at some insights coming out of migration studies, border studies, and citizenship studies. What we'll find is, first of all, that these come from quite different perspectives, but I think they converge at quite similar findings on this issue, namely, at least to an extent, normative arguments in favor of increased freedom of movement across international lines. Second of all, we'll observe that these three approaches, migration, border, citizenship studies, lack a framework for analyzing the action of irregular migration or for getting at the processes of social change. And this is where civil resistance theory comes in. Civil resistance theory is one of my major specializations. But before we can appreciate how civil resistance sheds some light on irregular migration, we need to talk a little bit about what civil resistance is. It's not what most people think. Most people think they have an idea about it, but then when you get into some of the details, you realize, it's a little bit more than I thought. So regarding civil resistance, I want to begin by considering that civil resistance is a stronger force for change than most people realize. It operates independent of states and state institutions, and it has been studied for its transnational and international application, but it has been, for the most part, studied in the domestic context within single countries. But what I'm trying to do here is show that indeed it has application for this transnational issue of irregular migration. And the other thing I want to just put up on the screen here to point out is migration, border, citizenship studies are relatively established and explored responses to this issue, whereas civil resistance is less so. And one of my aims here today is to bring it closer to the center of these discussions. So first of all, the context. What are we talking about? To begin, I don't want to go too deeply into the numbers, but we'll put them up there. Migration or a migrant is defined very broadly. It simply means someone who moves from one place to another for any reason. And you can see up there from the numbers, most migration happens within a given country. That could include moving from one city to another or from the countryside to the city, but it also includes migration across borders. This is a huge number, 1 billion people. What that refers to is 1 billion people today are living in somewhere other than the place where they're from. And that's a very large number, and it certainly comes with its own challenges, but what I want to focus on is a smaller number and a much more acute challenge, and this is a subset of that number, approximately 68 million people currently forcibly displaced around the world. That includes about 40 million displaced within a country and about 28 million displaced across borders. The bulk of those are currently registered refugees, and the remainder are those seeking to be accepted as refugees. Refugee, of course, is a status that comes with registered protection. You fall under the protection of international institutions and organizations. And another subset of this large number of migrants in the world today that we're more concerned with is the undocumented. Whereas most migrants are official, formal, registered, according to the law, there's about 30 million undocumented migrants in the world today. And these people are not under the purview of the state or any institutional protection. In fact, they're trying to remain outside of the purview of the state and off the radar of state institutions. So they have their own kind of vulnerability, yes.
So how do you go about estimating the undocumented migrants?
That's a good question, and I'm not exactly sure what the methods are to arrive at that, but I've got a couple of sources I could share with you. It's certainly an estimate, whereas the refugee numbers are known down to the individual number because they're tracked and registered. So this undocumented figure is an estimate. I don't know exactly the methodology, but that's a good question. If you remind me later, I'll show you a couple of excellent sources on that. Okay, now, so these are obviously precarious situation that people in this, the 68 million displaced and the 30 million undocumented, there's some overlap in these categories, but it's more than just struggling to find a place in the international system. It actually can be quite fatal. Since 2015, it's estimated that at least 18,000 migrants have died in transit, more than half of those in the Mediterranean Sea, making it the deadliest border in the world. The last thing I want to say on this slide is that if some of this language and the concepts seem a little bit complicated or convoluted, that's because they are. And I think that reflects the difficulty we have as a society for thinking or seeing outside of our taken for granted notions of the world. We live in an international world of nation states, and millions of people have fallen through those cracks. They have lost the protection of national citizenship, and they've found themselves in the jungle, so to speak. They're vulnerable. It's as if they're trapped on the outside of civilization looking in. It's the kind of situation that I'm trying to convey that a lot of people are in. And to give some examples that we're probably all aware of, maybe the one that comes to mind most is we know that there's more than 5 million Syrian refugees since 2012. This is part of the refugee crisis that we've been hearing about for the last few years. Comparable numbers from Afghanistan and from South Sudan, making their way towards Europe, but mostly housed in refugee camps in the Middle East. Maybe less familiar to a lot of people, there's now more than 2 million displaced or refugee or economic migrants from Venezuela since 2014, especially in the last couple of years. We know that there's hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims from Myanmar, currently in camps in Bangladesh. We know that every Friday in the Gaza Strip, tens of thousands of Palestinians march to Israel's militarized border, protesting the blockade and demanding the right to return to their homes in what is now Israel. The majority of people in Gaza are also refugees. We've been hearing a lot in the news about Latin American migrant caravans making their way up from Central America through Mexico towards the US border. These received a lot of news, but in fact, they maybe don't belong in the category of irregular migration technically because they're trying to reach the US border in a perfectly legal fashion and file claims for asylum. So technically not irregular, but I would say highly irregular in other ways. The publicity it's received, the large numbers of people on the move, its impact in US elections and politics today, And many of them certainly fall into the category of vulnerable or precarious because the U.S. is not adhering to proper asylum processing standards with these. They're trying to limit the amount of asylum claims, putting claimants, leaving claimants in Mexico rather than processing them in the U.S., or just refusing to accept claimants at all. And even, this isn't just a far away issue. In Canada, we have been exposed in the news for the last couple of years about tens of thousands of asylum seekers walking across the U.S. border into Canada since about 2017. And this has become a bit of a political issue in Canada, a bit of a football that the parties are, some of the opposition parties are making hay with. And at the bottom I put, what is this? How can we understand? How should we think about what's happening with these many millions of people? And I put the question, whither human rights? And I guess what I'm trying to say is that with these kinds of exceptions, we get a good sense of the limits of our current bounds of political inclusion. It reveals somewhat the myth of human rights, that without the proper national citizenship, humans don't even have the right to have rights. Without the proper national citizenship, bare humanity is scarcely human at all, at least in the way that we in the international community treat them. And these are not new ideas or new realities. We find it in critical and post-structural international relations studies, especially in political theorists like Giorgio Agamben and Hannah Arendt. But these numbers are unprecedented and they are increasing.
In this analysis or collection of data on migrants, is there a differentiation made between migrants who are trying to migrate because of maybe droughts like maybe in Syria, or the local dictatorial and those sort of governments pushing them out? What about those that result from war, inflicted upon them? Is there data available on those types of migrations?
I think to an extent, but I think Nicole might be better able to answer this particular question. But essentially, refugee is a very narrow quality, and it refers only to fear of political persecution.
For refugee. Okay.
For refugee. So anything else falls into the category of migrant, which becomes like a catch-all. And then, of course, research is being done to try and parse out why these people are moving. We use terms like economic migrant. Some people are debating today whether we should introduce the concept of climate migrants to make sense of this all. Yeah, it's a good question. So let's turn to some social science responses. And just to put a quick disclaimer here, by no means is this discussion meant to be exhaustive of social science approaches to the issue of irregular migration, nor is it meant to be exhaustive of these particular approaches to irregular migration. We're just going to scratch the surface, draw a few insights out, basically just get our fingers wet. So let's start with migration studies. Migration studies is a multidisciplinary, wide and diverse research field, and it's tough to even put a label on something like migration studies because it's so large and diverse, and there's something of a coherent body of research developing, or has been for many years. And migration studies, of course, is concerned with the big picture of migration and has been increasingly dealing with this more acute problem of refugees and irregular migration in the last few years. One of the things that we glean from migration studies is that many studies are identifying what might be called a gap between facts and norms. And one way of thinking about this is the difference between a very fluid transnational life that many people experience and live versus a very rigid international structure imposed on their lives. So on the one hand, they move around a lot, they have multiple citizenships, they maybe have homes in different countries, they have families in different countries, They might identify their home in different countries. So people are, global society today is more transnational than ever before, yet the old structures of the nation-state system that define and limit movement are still very much in place. And so there's a bit of a disconnect there between the way many people experience their lives and the structures that we're confined to living in. And another aspect of a bit of a disconnect between what we might call facts and norms is the gap between legal obligations and common practice. So for example, there's a lot of international law translated into domestic law about how refugees and asylum seekers must be treated, and that is increasingly at odds with what's actually happening. So we get examples, I mentioned already the example of President Trump's practices at the southern US border, violating international agreements surrounding the treatment of asylum seekers. Also, we could think of the European Union deal that was struck with Turkey, by which Europe is effectively giving Turkey all sorts of money to take back asylum seekers, which is contrary to the European Union's obligations under international law. And also this disconnect between human rights, which is the ideal, and the reality of national rights. That is to say, we talk a lot and think a lot about human rights, but in reality, when you lose that national citizenship protection, you have no human rights. So there's this tension between human rights and the system of national rights we actually live under. Something else you find from looking at migration studies, and I think this comes from the very fact of the subject matter, dealing with these issues, with these disconnects, and looking at the people themselves, you tend to find that migration studies are often explicitly normative or ethical. And that is a bit of a contrast from border studies, which has often been more associated with a bit more of a state-centric approach or a realist approach, and not so much into normative and ethical questions, though there are exceptions to this either way. And in migration studies, there's a variety of approaches, and in particular, I've encountered a number of creative responses to the challenge of irregular migration. So some migrant scholars have decided that instead of talking about international law and human rights, let's just take a practical, people-centric, pragmatic approach. What do these particular individuals need in the place that they are? Is it housing? Is it education? Various other social services? And let's not really get into the ideals or the notions of universalism, and let's just talk in a practical way. That's been one approach of migration scholars. Another has been to try to adapt the lessons of securitization to these vulnerable populations. I've seen studies where securitization sometimes has a bad rap. It's basically the idea that by describing something in security or insecurity terms, you can create an urgency around it that allows governments to sometimes get things done a little bit quicker. So if an issue is portrayed as a security threat, you can lift it out of regular institutions and processes and kind of deal with it in a more effective manner. Some people are saying this is how we need to think about refugees. The securitization, we need to look at it from the security perspective of the people themselves. They're in a condition of severe insecurity, and by describing it that way, we can maybe mobilize some aspects of the state that wouldn't otherwise be mobilized to deal with some of these challenges. I've even seen at least one article try to apply the notion of R2P to refugee flows. Responsibility to protect refers to relatively new doctrine in international law that says if a state, well, I guess what it says is states are responsible for ensuring the protection of their populations. And the implication of that is that when a state is no longer providing protection for its population, other states can step in. So this doctrine of responsibility to protect has been used for various forms of humanitarian intervention. Think about the case in Libya. R2P was invoked in 2011. The government of Libya is not protecting its people, so we in NATO, the international community, are going to go in and protect those people where the state has failed. So this approach has been applied to refugees, saying we, the international community, if we have a responsibility to protect Libyans in Libya or any population anywhere in their country, why does it cease to apply when they cross an international boundary? So some creative approaches to the issue of irregular migration coming from migration studies. Similarly with border studies, to move very quickly, also a multidisciplinary research field, difficult to say that it's, it has clear parameters, it's a diverse, growing, thriving research field. But one thing that comes out of it very quickly is you realize that borders are complex institutions and processes shaped by a multiplicity of governance. Governance in terms of actors and governance in terms of scale or levels of governance. And the point of this is just to say, sometimes we naturalize borders, or we think of them as necessarily in the current form of governance that they are, but they actually have developed over time very contingently through competing political factors, power issues, cultural, social, historical, political factors, and that these it's variable. A really interesting insight coming out of border studies is that borders are often quite central to politics, not just at the margins. They're not always just at the edges or the periphery of the metropole of politics. Rather, national identity and politics are very often forged in border regions and then radiate outward. I think this is important because it reminds us to pay attention to what happens at borders, that what happens at borders can have an outsized impact on politics. And again, as this issue of irregular migration and all the friction between people and borders that we've already alluded to, this insight should tell us that this could have more significant consequences for politics in the future than maybe we realize. Also from border studies, there are a few useful concepts have emerged that I think have interesting applicability to the challenges posed by irregular migration. One is this notion of the lived experience of people, the lived experience of borderlanders. And the idea here is reacting to a frustration with the notion, a simplified notion of borders as a simple line that divides one territory from another. That doesn't tell you a lot about what's actually happening. So a lot of scholars have focused, let's look at the people. What is the actual lived experience of people who live in border regions like? Let's look at it from their perspective rather than the perspective of states and borders. And you can gain some insights about what borders are doing and how they change over time. A related concept is the concept of borderscapes. Borderscapes, coming out of critical geography relating to border studies, is this notion again trying to make more complicated, more nuanced our analysis of what's happening at borders. Again, not just lines dividing territory, but complex, three-dimensional, structured over time. There's ups and downs, there's valleys, there's rocks, there's maybe there's streams flowing through the landscape. So the idea behind the borderscape is to try and paint a border region as a dynamic, diverse, much more organic kind of context than we might otherwise think. And I'm also really interested in the idea of global flows or mobilities. Borders and Globalization is doing a lot of work in this area. Trade or other forms of crossing of borders, whether it's data or climate issues, things that are basically in flux, not confined to the grid of the international. And all of these have implications for people on the move. I think all of these can help us see life and the lived experience and the mobility of refugees and irregular migrants in ways that maybe open up a little space to actually see what life is like from their perspective and get our heads out of the international state system, which is very heavily focused on borders, then to an extent that the experiences of migrants is often lost. A major insight for me is that borders are not just castle walls. They're also entry ports. They're managers of flow. And this should have implications for migrants and refugees. We think in our society it's very, the default response is that, oh yeah, borders should be there to block people. But in fact, borders have always been managers of flows. And why is it that we put people into a category of exclusion more so than we do flows of trade or capital or multinational corporations doing business across borders? We seem to have left the most vulnerable among us in the category of exclusion and denied them the same sort of analysis as something that has the capacity or the right to flow through borders. Another insight coming out of some border studies is that borders actually inflict a shocking and discriminatory amount of violence against these populations. I say discriminatory because it's not indiscriminate in that borders are equally violent to all people. They are specifically violent to those who have lost the right to have rights, those who have lost their national citizenship protection, and borders do incredible violence. As we looked at the stat of 18,000 people dying trying to cross borders, and we know, for example, in the Gaza Strip, but also in Egypt, border security officers regularly fire upon people approaching the border. So these are just a few examples of the violence that people trying to pass through borders are subject to. And this is an interesting point that I hope maybe we can talk a bit more about. And I think Emmanuel might disagree with me on this. We've spoken a bit about it before. It is the idea that free movement, and this is something that I'm drawing out of border studies. Free movement is actually not a threat to borders. The free movement of people, I mean, to allow greater access for migrants on the move to pass through borders is not a threat to borders. It doesn't mean that we'll move towards a borderless world or a world without borders any more than we did with free trade. In the 1990s, people talked a lot about globalization and the rise of free trade, and this is going to be the end of the nation state, the end of borders. But in fact, what happened is at the same time as free trade increased and flows of goods and capital increased across borders, borders didn't go away. They adapted. They in some ways became more complex and in some ways even more robust in taking on this new role of overseeing these flows. So my point here is that trade doesn't happen behind the backs of states. They still pass through ports, they still get tracked, but we're just removing restrictions on movement. But it's still going through borders. Something like an illegal drug trade across a state border where it's happening underground, so to speak, that is undermining or defying a border. But what happens when globalization and free trade as we experience it is not that. The borders and globalization are perfectly compatible. And my suggestion is the implication is we can talk about increased freedom of movement for migrants without also saying things like borderless world or an end of borders.
So how do you define threat here?
Threat? What do you mean?
You say free movement is not a threat to borders.
Yes, I just meant not a threat to borders in the sense of borders are perfectly compatible with movement. Free movement doesn't need to undermine borders. Free movement doesn't need to reduce the significance or erase borders. It's not a threat to borders in that sense. Both can be.
But is that what is holding back nations from letting people in, or the fact that there are consequences of people coming in terms of employment, in terms of inter-group issues? So those are the threats. Border itself. So
That's a really good question, and I don't exactly know what the threat to borders is perceived to be. But I think that you're right to point this out, that a lot of the discourse around why we do not have more open borders for the flow of people is exactly what you said: more domestic fears, social concerns, and this is an issue that is very much under debate, because just, you could imagine a situation where if your borders were overrun by millions of people, it would be incredibly disruptive and destabilizing for a society. But does that mean that we've got the proper balance today?
Okay, so maybe I don't know much about. It's pretty clear I don't know much about what I'm about to say. I'm trying to think of the inside of Schengen and the sort of the soft borders between, say, France and Germany. Those borders, there is no real barrier to the flow of people across those, right? But those borders haven't ceased to exist. They still matter because it seems to me that at least at an epistemological level, the act of regulating flows across borders reifies the existence of borders in the first place. But also, it seems that if we recognize that borders are in fact multidimensional, four-dimensional constructs that exist across time and space, but are also composed of more than state-level sort of interventions or exclusions. The physical geopolitical border might have more or less dissolved along that borderline, but the cultural boundaries remain. The linguistic boundaries are still there. The historical barrier or boundaries are still there. And there is certainly now the potential for unlimited travel across that border, and yet people don't. Right? Because it seems that there's other mechanisms in place. So I'm not saying that there is this threat of like, we open borders, all of a sudden everybody's moving everywhere. I think I tend to agree that the free movement across borders doesn't seem to present any kind of real existential threat. How am I wrong, Cole?
Well, I was thinking of the example of Schengen too, and what I was thinking is that the simultaneous reduction of border control for people and labor within Europe was matched by the externalization of Europe's borders, right? So in terms of the control of people, I don't know, I defer to Emmanuel on this, but the border control within the European Union or between members of the European Union were reduced, but amplified elsewhere to control people coming into that space. So then there is just kind of an externalization or a offshoring or shift of where that border is to control people coming into that space. Mm-hmm. But I think your point is right about national identity is still alive and well in Europe despite the Schengen.
Yeah.
I would add, it's not just very good points. The Schengen zone is not a borderless zone, but it's border controls are lifted on the movement of people. But I would say more than even just still mapping on to cultural and identity issues. Those borders are still there. They mark jurisdictional limits too. Yeah. There are still laws that these states have that end at that limit. And so the borders remain, but the flow of people is allowed to pass through. Yeah. And I think that your point is important, that a lot of people thought there would be a whole lot more moving of people from relatively poor countries in Europe into the relatively affluent, and I think the numbers bore out that didn't happen to the extent that people thought it would. But Nicole is also very right that it's not a perfect example, because what they reduced in border controls on people within Europe, they put on steroids for the periphery. Right, yeah. They basically kicked the border as a exclusion zone of the flow of people to the outer perimeter of Europe. Mm-hmm. And there are also arguments that rebut the kind of common concern that most people would think, if we just allow an influx of people, there'll be job issues and strain on the social welfare system. There's also arguments that freer flow of people would actually be a massive economic boon for GDP and all sorts of services. The fact of the matter is we haven't really tried. And so there's a lot of debate about what the impacts would be about loosening border controls. But it's not clear, I think, what the real social ramifications would be.
But so are you saying that the external borders of Europe are harder than they were within Europe before Schengen?
That's my understanding, with all the creation of the police forces and the beefing up of security along the edge of the Mediterranean. Is that not the case?
I think this is a policy answer to a very specific situation, which is that Europe has become richer and more attractive but the borders would have been hard whether they were Spanish or European, Italian or European, Greek or European, Romanian or European. And that's my point about Schengen. I think Schengen is interesting for within Europe. The borders of Schengen, like of the outside, the periphery of Europe, are just hard borders, like any other hard borders.
But
They're not harder.
can Poland and Italy compare with Frontex in terms of policing and surveillance and factors?
Yes, I think they can. Actually, the function of surveillance that has been taken by Frontex is the same. I mean, the only major difference is that certain functions are operated outside of Warsaw. Italy doesn't have very much to do in terms of the Frontex teams. I should check. But I know Warsaw for sure is the headquarters of Frontex.
But I think recently,
I mean, people have made the argument, but I disagree with it.
but I think recently Frontex has shifted from Frontex replaced the Italian search and rescue I think, operations with a much more military surveillance, border security mentality. So the mandate of search and rescue that was of the mandate of the states on the northern Mediterranean all got offloaded onto the European Union, to Frontex, and then to the European Border Security Group, whatever they're called now. And there was a shift. So I think there was a hardening that came with that shift from mandate of search and rescue in the Mediterranean to mandate of securitized, militarized, external European border at the southern end of the Mediterranean.
Wouldn't the very act of unifying border policy and the other sort of around the periphery, wouldn't that just have the effect of increasing, of making the borders harder? Because a unification of those border control systems creates a singular frontier rather than a multitude.
Well, yeah, and I think the other thing you could do is look at the amount of money that is spent on the securing of the external border versus the amount of money in infrastructure and surveillance. I mean, it came at a time when technology and surveillance and all of that was exploding. But I think if you look at the infrastructure and the funding of the between the European members and what's at the external border, you could very easily make an argument that it is harder now than it was when it was within
But
Europe.
my point is that the states would have hiked
Themselves, yeah.
And it could also be that the European
Canada.
Union regulations tie the hands of what might otherwise be.
hardening the border, right? The EU is hardening the peripheral border because it actually enacts states' will through the European Council decisions. Otherwise, they wouldn't. So if Frontex has more power today and more staff, actually since 2015, it doubled staff and its budget was multiplied by 4, and got also many more functions, it is because the member states have asked for it. Now, the one thing that we need to be careful with that hardening of borders is a reaction to, a very specific crisis, the increase of migrants across the periphery, right? So I think that any one member states that would have become more attractive would have hardened their borders. That's not all they do, though, right? They are the most attractive union in the world, or group of states in the world, because they have the most welcoming policy for, at least for asylum seekers, right? There is no doubt that once you are labeled as an asylum seeker, you have your blue card in Europe, you have access to all kind of social, educational, health policies that are not, for instance, at the same standard in Canada or the US, let alone the rest of the world. And that makes the EU member states very attractive. But that's not Schengen, that's not the EU borders, that's Dublin. That's the Dublin Convention.
I can't help but think it may be a moot point whether or not the walls of Fortress Europe are qualitatively different or more robust than the walls of individual states would have been. I think the point was just that Europe is not an ideal example of the positive effects of reducing borders, because it kind of fudges that fact by simply shifting the borders. So whether or not the borders are more exclusive or not may be a moot point. And I think that the policies that you talk about, reflecting the will of the member states, it wasn't a necessary, it's still a political decision, and it didn't have to be that decision. It's not like that was the only response, right?
See, for me, it's a balance between Dublin, which is the regulatory system to welcome migrants, and Schengen, which enforces hard borders at the periphery. And the states right now, it's true, post 2014-15, that's kind of what the Jean-Monnet Network grant that we've worked on shows, have agreed to harden the periphery. They are still they are still struggling with disagreements because of the rise of nationalist movements across the EU to actually hike basically the Dublin policy. Dublin 1, 2, 3, whatever has happened to Dublin, is not as generous as some of the human rights groups, but not just human rights groups. Some of the European people would want to see, which is a much more generous and much more welcoming policy for migrants into Europe. And the 12 billion that Nicole is talking about, which is actually true, I mean, it's quite amazing to realize how much the EU was able to harness resources for the periphery. Didn't go as much. It's only 1/3, it's about 4 billion that went into helping the states basically strengthen Dublin. So that's, for me, that's kind of the data that we have to look at this balance in policy choice that actually supports what you say, right? Because it actually is there. That's where it is located. That's why I wrote the Jean-Monnet Network grant, because I thought it would be really interesting to see if other states were going to be more generous than the Europeans. That's why we looked at Japan and Canada. I doubt, frankly, that even with much smaller numbers, our country has been more generous. It might have been, and I think it's possible that we could compare, that Canada might have actually a much more generous policy because it has a tradition, a well-developed bureaucracy, and a tradition too of welcoming immigrants. And so as part of that package, it may have the ability, but under the Trudeau government, people who have come in the country are still really vetted to the end, right? It's really a careful vetting of who comes in the country. And the numbers are very small. Right? So when we compare, for instance, the influx of migrants into the EU in 15, 16, we're talking about 1.1 million, basically, that walk into the EU in 15, 16, and then 16 is like it drops, but it's still hundreds of thousands of people who are walking in percentage of population. Canada has let in maybe 55,000 people since 15 as asylum seekers. In proportion of the population, it's much, much smaller.
Yeah, the comparison is tough. No doubt that the Canadian laws and perhaps the public as well are more welcoming. But how much of that is old world, new world difference? How much of that is proximity to the source of the flows of people?
Yeah. But I agree with your statement, actually, that borders inflict shocking and indiscriminate violence, and free movement is not a threat to borders, but I say free movement is not a threat to boundaries, to be more specific. And borders are becoming much more complex, because you have border policies in welcoming migrants, and you have border policies in camps. And that's the whole issue of the migration versus the border studies issue, right? Is that we're not looking, but the functions actually is like a deck of cards is being spread across different policies. Whereas in the past, the border policy stopped at the boundary line, and today it's not true anymore. The border policies are as much inside Turkey as they are in Paris airport. And that's a huge issue, because then we mix up everything. We also have camps in Roissy, by the way. with hundreds of people. So
Okay, well, a
that's
fascinating
that's
area.
kind of my point on this, too, like.
Yeah, I think it's very important to remember to keep bordering processes
And
separate
look at the
from
data.
conceptually from the boundary line.
This is just a question for myself. Frontex, what is this concept, Frontex?
It's an EU agency. It's an EU agency.
Doing what?
Well, it basically, originally it's an EU agency that collected and shared and trained people across the different member states.
Okay.
It enforces like intelligence, and then it trains, different border guards.
FRONTEX, that is,
Yes.
so thank you, I'll check it.
Yeah.
What does
It
it
has
stand for?
functions that you may
Frontier?
know from, for instance, Department of
Externalization.
Homeland Security. It has some of those functions at the EU level, but the very big difference is that it's more of an agency that brings the states together to cooperate on some things. Its staff until 15 was under 1,500 people. So it's a small, high-level strategical agency. But it has had resources, and it has, for instance, as Nicole was making reference to, it has different policies, for instance, to either help people at sea or to prevent people from actually coming inside EU seas and so on and so forth, right?
It's a
So
supranational.
it's kind of a supranational agency. It's an EU level agency.
Monitors, polices, the exterior borders. I think, as you suggested, one of the reasons it exists is because a lot of member states in the EU said, no, we don't want to lower our immigration controls on our borders. We're afraid of what might happen. So the European response was, we'll do it within the European zone, and we'll guarantee that we'll police the perimeter of Europe, so to assuage some of those fears, I think.
Yeah. Post 2015, Frontex budget and staff increased almost exponentially. The staffing and the authority of Frontex, even with the creation of a European border agency, which actually is now kind of an extraction of Frontex, is the creation of a European border agency that trains people and also coordinates their actions, standardizes their action. So Frontex staff increased by, I think, 900 people. It almost, it went almost to 2,500, and the budget was multiplied by 4. So it started as a fairly small budget, and then in terms of action, it kind of went up.
Thank you.
And I don't want to suggest that border studies is monolithic, or this is, all border studies reflect this. These are just some sort of insights or findings that I've kind of cherry-picked out of border studies that have applicability to the question of irregular migration. Some interesting insights also come out of citizenship studies. I guess we should first define what a citizen is, and from the perspective of citizen studies, a citizen is a member of the political community. A free and equal member of a political community is a citizen. So it's basically membership in the club of politics. And it comes with rights and responsibilities, but this is not membership in any ordinary club. It's not like being in a film club or a sports league or an academic institution. Being a citizen, being a member of the state, it has the power to set and change the conditions for all other clubs, so to speak, and by force if necessary. So citizenship basically just refers to the group of people who have a say in the governance of a place. And an interesting finding or observation in citizenship studies is that in the modern world we have really conflated or fused or elided citizen with national. So when we think of a citizen, we could also say a national. If you think of a Canadian national, it means basically the same thing as a Canadian citizen. We're talking about the same thing, someone who has political rights within Canada. But the interesting thing is that citizenship as a concept is more than 2,000 years old, whereas nationalism is just a couple hundred years old. So it's a very recent modern phenomena that we've attached to the notion of citizenship, this national criteria. And I think that's significant for irregular migration, because the initial notion of citizenship was that if all people are equal, should have free and equal political rights in a community, that was not necessarily grounded in an ethnicity or a national style identity or a cultural identity. It was just by virtue of being a person there, so to speak. Now, of course, a citizen was not a completely universal concept, and it is oftentimes only applied to privileged special classes. In particular, in the beginning, citizen was a concept that was pretty much restricted to male heads of family who owned property, for example. So the citizenry of a polity might be a tiny minority of the population, but built into this concept of being a free and equal member in a political community is kind of a progressive or universalizing impulse. That this notion of political access, political rights, has been continually expanded to new groups, to new sectors of society. Not perfectly or in some sort of necessary teleological way, but it has this power built into it. If you look at the United States Declaration of Independence, they talk a lot about, sometimes they use the language of citizenship, sometimes not, but this is what they're talking about, that all men are created equal. And of course it was written by slave owners. Yet that very rhetoric was used over time to gradually pry that privileged right to a more expansive population over time. In citizenship studies, migrant rights today are often viewed as one front in citizenship struggles, including various, in fact, all forms of social, economic, cultural rights struggles, claims or struggles for recognition of rights, whether from LGBTQ communities or various what we sometimes think of as identity politics, racially organized movements, even something like Black Lives Matter. Think of a civil rights struggle. All of these can be described in the rubric of citizenship. They're basically demanding greater recognition of rights vis-a-vis the political community. And so the potential here then is that there is an opening for expanding citizenship rights to migrants. And of course we do that. We have a system for that. Every polity determines how it works. Sometimes it's based on long extended periods of residence. Sometimes it's based on family connections or birth. But it's restricted, it's still tightly controlled, and irregular migrants are effectively shut out. And there's potential there to expand to say, well, why is it that by the lottery of birth, some people are excluded from this powerful notion of free and equal membership in the political community, and that maybe it's feasible if we can break apart the concept of citizenship from national identity, there is more possibility for increasing migrant rights, specifically increasing freedom of movement for people across international boundaries. There's an increasing body of work on global citizenship. Global citizenship is a program that is specifically pushing against citizenship that is locked in the territorial national state and saying that model doesn't match the world anymore. People have multiple identities. In fact, the idea is that people have multiple citizenship from the global perspective says we should recognize that people have rights wherever they are, and they should be determined by the various relationships that they find themselves in, and that citizenship is defined by the practices of your life, more so than a singular status. And we have multiple practices that may be confined to a single small community, but may also have a very global reach. And we can't pretend that these territorial boundaries can lock that in. And so global citizenship is trying to create a space in the discourse for expanding citizenship from the singular national identity to a more global, pluralistic sense of right. So this would include, it basically would imply a bit of democratizing of global governance. You know, we currently may be subject to the influences of powerful multinational corporations, but we have no say over them at all. The notion of global citizenship says those who are affected by a set of conditions should have some say in those conditions. Yet, all of this is still very much ideal, much more ideal than real, and they're confronting the stubborn persistence of this national notion of citizenship. James Tully, in his work on global citizenship, is a bit of an exception. He certainly holds these ideals, but he tries to look at ways in which actions and lives of people are actually beginning to transgress the national boundary. And in fact, some of James Tully's work on global citizenship is tapping civil resistance literature toward that end. So I want to turn to civil resistance literature now, but just before I do, highlight some commonalities or shared features between what we've looked at so far. Between border migration and citizenship studies, we found that these are pretty prevalent academic responses to migration challenges. They show that exclusions based on the birthplace lottery are unfair, inconsistent with values, and contingent. By contingent, I mean not that it didn't have to be this way. This is the product of complex social factors and power struggle. They also highlight, I think each of them highlight, this troubling gap between ought and is, between what we would think would be a more reasonable world and what the world actually is. Yet these three approaches, I find, for the most part, continue to operate within a framework that privilege the state as the central unit of analysis, looking at developments or issues below a state, smaller than the state level, and also above a state level, but continually coming back to the state as the primary unit of analysis. And I also think that these approaches, while they reveal a lot of arguments for change in border governance, at least for some improved migrant rights, they don't really offer a path to change. They're weak on action analysis and change mechanisms, which I want to pull out from civil resistance studies to fill that gap. Civil resistance, also known as nonviolent resistance, nonviolent struggle, nonviolent conflict, civil disobedience, civic protest, civic dissent, peaceful protest, unarmed struggle, unarmed insurrection, collective action, civilian defiance, people power, maybe contentious politics we could throw in there, popular protest, popular resistance, popular struggle. These are all different terms that are used in this research literature. Now, the term civil resistance, I think, is problematic and very misleading for a number of reasons. I don't really want to get into that now, but I'm using it anyway because it is probably the most prevalent term associated with this body of research. So I'm using it to signify that I'm dealing with and tapping this particular body of literature. It's problematic in a few ways because the term civil denotes some connotations that the field of study is actually trying to move away from. So it doesn't mean civil in the sense of very calm and polite, and one group wanting to sit down and have a civil cup of tea with the other. It's not civil in that sense, it's civil in the sense of civilian. It's resistance or struggle undertaken by civilians. And it can actually be quite uncivil in its operation. Resistance is also a little problematic for me because it's so tied to negative or reactionary action. It implies that you're only reacting to something or against something, and doesn't leave a lot of room for struggles for something. It always implies an opponent that you're pushing back against. But this is the name we're stuck with. It's probably the key term in the literature. Actually, maybe nonviolent resistance is as equally common for this. I try to stay away from the term nonviolent because nonviolence has a lot more baggage even than the term civil. So we're going to use the term civil resistance, noting that it's a little bit problematic. But it's the ideas that I think are strong, but even though the name could use some improvement.
It's the biggest footnote I've ever heard.
So what is civil resistance theory? The basic idea is all government is based on the cooperation of the governed, and that cooperation can be withdrawn. This idea goes back to Russian novelist and thinker Leo Tolstoy, of course most developed by Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. in the Civil Rights Movement, was tapping this literature and this research and learning from this. Now, I'm not suggesting that Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King constitute anything like a social science, but their body of work and their ideas became the basis of a very robust research literature called Civil Resistance Studies. And maybe the earliest piece of social science on it would be by a fellow named Clarence Marsh Case, who in 1923 published a book of case studies of civil resistance. He called it a different name, but Richard Gregg is another one, and probably the leading name associated with the study of civil resistance today is Gene Sharp. He recently passed away, but he kind of wrote the book in the 1970s about civil resistance. Sharp's contribution was to map out the idea and the practice of civil resistance, looking at proposing a very technical theory of power, proposing a system of a rubric of categorization for talking about different types of action, a rubric for talking about and categorizing different kinds of mechanisms of change. And let's start with the theory of power. Basically, the idea is that power is popular. Real power is about people acting in concert. It's plural, it's social, it's relational. It's not strictly material or economic or military. This idea is that power does not flow from the barrel of a gun, as some revolutionaries have said, like Chairman Mao. The idea is that power emerges from people acting in concert. And kind of the central framework in terms of withdrawing the cooperation of the governed or withdrawing the consent is popular collective action kind of swings between obedience and disobedience, or cooperation, non-cooperation, consent and dissent. Non-cooperating with institutions that are oppressive or the target of a movement, and cooperating with those institutions or popular organizations that are alternative to whatever, maybe it's a military dictatorship that people are organizing against, maybe it's a much more local struggle and it's something to do with the municipality, maybe it's a struggle against abuses of a corporation, but the idea is that we empower the systems of government that we find ourselves in by cooperating with them, and we can undermine them by withdrawing that cooperation. Civil resistance theory, it contains a critique of violence, of direct violence, whether the violence of people in protest, like revolutionary violence, or the counter-violence of repression of a state. This critique of violence applies to both, and the idea is that violence has a tendency to be politically counterproductive. And the basis of that is the idea that it can actually corrode the kind of power that you're trying to build. It can backfire, it can discourage participation. So for a variety of reasons, violence is singled out as counterproductive to the aims of a popular movement. Specific to civil resistance theory, the emphasis is on the pragmatic efficacy of it, the strategic power of it. So the emphasis is that violence is counterproductive. It may also be morally and ethically wrong, but that's not the major claim that these strategists are making. Strategists of nonviolence are trying to say, we study it and people use it because it works. It may also be morally superior, but let's avoid that dichotomy that says nonviolence is ethically superior and violence is more practically powerful. They say, no, that's wrong. Civil resistance can actually be a much more effective way to struggle. And not just against liberal governments. It's not something that only works in the context of an England or a United States. Some people have posited that civil resistance, you have to be dealing with a government that is already democratic and respecting of human rights in order for it to work. The idea being that only a government that is democratic and respecting of human rights would be persuaded and have a change of heart to change some unjust laws or meet the protesters' demands, whereas an oppressive regime is just going to walk over them. That's wrong. The major focus of civil resistance studies is that it works against police states, oppressive regimes, and sometimes even across and against borders. There is a bit of a subset of civil resistance that looks at transnational and international civil resistance, a bit of a smaller or peripheral to the main body of research and case studies, which are very much specific to individual countries. And much less explored is the application of civil resistance to irregular migration, which is my focus here. So the emphasis is pragmatic and strategic more than principled or moral. That includes a focus on methods and action more than motives and intention. Well, motives and intention are important and can be factored into this, but we're really interested in looking at what people do more than what people believe. What works is the key question, not what is the morally correct thing to do. How did they do it? What methods did they use? This is a framework that allows researchers to study civil resistance in a variety of contexts by kind of demoting or eliminating or reducing at least the motives and questions of morality and ethics and of intention. You can start seeing civil resistance in all sorts of places that you might not have. So the idea of nonviolent struggle as opposed to armed struggle is pretty new. It's kind of 20th century thing. But with this framework, we can go back through history and see it everywhere. You can go back and look at the American Revolution and start picking out the various methods of non-cooperation that they used, of protest or other methods that we'll see in a moment of what constitutes civil resistance, and think about the various non-cooperation of the colonies with the British imperial system. Think of the Boston Tea Party, great act of civil disobedience, the alternative institutions of the town halls, usurping the authority of British rule. So very much a powerful case study of instances of civil resistance. You can go back to ancient Rome and look at the study or the struggle of the plebs, of the common people against the patrician class, and see all sorts of these methods of civil resistance. So the framework of focusing on methods rather than what people are thinking in their minds or the motives for why they're using their actions opens up a whole vista to see what works and draw lessons from that. And I think that is important for us here because it allows us to apply this framework to irregular migration. Of course, most people, when they are trying to cross a border under the radar of the state, they're not thinking politically, they're not opposed to borders per se, they're interested in their family on the other side. But we can still look at the impact of their actions through this framework because we can kind of sweep their motives under the carpet and just look at the effects of the action that they're undertaking itself. And I should add, I wanted to mention too, there's a growing body of empirical research on this. Probably the lead study in the field by Chenoweth and Stephan in 2008 and then subsequently a book in 2011 did a massive study of 323 case studies of civil resistance against a variety of regimes, including against foreign military occupation, including domestic struggles for regime change within a country, and other struggles for group rights within a state. So a variety of contexts, not just within liberal states, and what they found was the movements which were predominantly nonviolent were twice as effective in terms of achieving the stated goals of the movement than the movements that were that included significant levels of armed or violent struggle.
What's the name of the book?
The book is called Why Civil Resistance Works. There's an article of the same name in International Affairs that you can get for free off the internet, which is basically a condensed version of the argument and the data, but the book is also available. Yeah, it's fascinating. So they're really bucking the notion that civil resistance is a weaker form of struggle than armed struggle. And it's counterintuitive because we have kind of all been brought up to think that violence is the method of last resort. Whereas people like Gene Sharpen in civil resistance theory are saying, no, actually collective action is the method of last resort. And if you're at that point where the regular institutional channels are no longer working, now you've got a choice. How are you going to struggle? And the idea here is if you choose popular action rather than armed struggle, you avoid a lot of pitfalls that come with violence, and you can actually have a stronger movement and lead to better results. So it's a fascinating research literature.
There's a whole body of this in social movement theory that we look at repertoires of contention.
Sure.
You can see it according to culture, so you can predict how, with a certain degree of certainty, but you can predict how different groups will act depending on their historical context. So when the Americans are pissed off, they march, Million Man March, Women's March, whatever. When the French are pissed off, they light cars on fire, or they engage in building barricades. When the Brits are pissed off, they come together and debate in town halls in very stuffy ways, because it's what works in the culture. It's a fascinating kind of thing, but it's...
That's really interesting, and I would put pretty much all of that under the rubric of civil resistance, even though a lot of people in the study of civil resistance would say, wait a minute, they burned something? That's violent, that's not civil resistance.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons I try and avoid the language of nonviolence, because it creates this image of all action needs to be saintly and perfectly nonviolent.
No.
Gandhi always said, you must be nonviolent not only in your action, but in your words and even in your thoughts. Civil resistance studies say, okay, well that's good, but you don't need that to be effective.
No.
You can hold a lot of animosity and anger. You can even maybe throw stones at the security forces, and we can still discern the dynamics of civil resistance in it, even though it contains minor elements of violence. The key is the disparity between the violence they're confronting and the limited violence that they're using. A distinction that I find much more helpful, some others do in the literature too, is the distinction between militarized and non-militarized struggle. That's the crucial divide that tends to be more applicable for making sense of the dynamics of a struggle. Did they resort to arms as opposed to the occasional person, throwing a tear gas canister back or lighting a barricade of tires on fire? The social movement literature is interesting. I find it a little bit more dry than what has kind of come out of the strategic civil resistance of Gene Sharp. Yes, I still find it a little bit weak on action analysis, but there's a lot to learn. Guys, what is it, like Sidney Tarot and a number of others like that, yeah.
No, sorry. Wait, what you say next before? Okay.
Where are we? Okay, so what I want to do now is look a little bit more at the methods of civil resistance. And Gene Sharp, the pioneer of civil resistance studies, is one of the things he's most known for is categorizing, or cataloging, I should say, a famous list of 198 methods of civil resistance. He scoured the history books and newspapers, and he studied movements, and he documented every time a movement used a method of action that was outside of conventional institutional channels. So this doesn't count calling up your politician. This doesn't count voting in an election. Those are that's politics as normal. Civil resistance is politics as abnormal. When those regular channels are deemed to be ineffective, and you sort of start operating cross-institution. And what sorts of methods are there? At the lowest level, you have communicative action. And some people question whether or not this is even a kind of struggle, because it's just words, it's just ideas, it's the level of discourse and communication. And I want to put this diagram up here. And what we're looking at is, the first thing I want to focus on in blue is communicative protest. In some ways, it is the least intense method of struggle. It is the least disruptive of a regime or a set of institutions, because really you're just talking. Maybe you're sending letters, you're writing petitions, maybe you come up with clever slogans, there's chants, there's signs, you're using social media. There's a whole range of communicative protests that can be considered part of civil resistance, and it is the most accessible to the widest range of participants, but again, it's about the weakest in terms of impact. And the second one that I've marked here in yellow signifies the domain of non-cooperation. This is more than just words. When it comes to communicative protest, maybe the point is for a movement to communicate a grievance, to highlight an injustice, to test the public mood for potential support. You're communicating to get a sense of how much the public is willing to support the movement. When you start to actually non-cooperate, now you're directly impacting the system. Non-cooperation, the classic examples are the strike and the boycott. Work strike, student strike, tax strike, boycotts of all kinds, boycotts of products, boycotts of government services. So social, economic, and political boycotts and strikes pretty much constitute this category of non-cooperation. But other things, resigning from posts, refusing to work with a corporation or a government ministry, whole range of activity fall under the heading of non-cooperation. Many people view this as the major set of teeth of civil resistance. This is where the brunt of the force of civil resistance comes from, and this is that notion of withdrawing the cooperation that all systems of power depend on. The notion is that governments, even oppressive regimes, their power doesn't emanate simply materially from their capacity to wield the implements of violence, but at every step of the way there are real people cooperating with that. Armies require individuals in uniform to pull the trigger, and if they're not cooperating with orders, that army becomes pretty weak. Extractive industries require all sorts of people to run the machines and to work the supply lines. At every aspect of power can be broken down to the people, the practices of people that make it work. And by withdrawing cooperation from that, you can deprive the regime of the social sources of power it needs, undermine its power, and eventually it can even collapse from if there's enough withdrawal of active participation in the system. And finally, non-cooperation was something that Gandhi really focused on. For him, that was almost the be-all and end-all of his thinking about the strategic efficacy of nonviolent struggle was in this non-cooperative domain. But Gene Sharp really highlighted that this notion of direct intervention, which the aim of an act of direct intervention is that it will always create a dilemma action for the opponent, for the state or the institution that you're targeting. And a direct intervention or a dilemma action could include a human chain blocking a freeway, a public occupation of a square, building alternative institutions to take care of communities, and in that sense not using state institutions. And while this one may be tends to be practiced by the narrowest segment of a movement or the population, it tends to have the greatest impact. So it's one thing to not show up for work, it's another thing to say block a busy freeway. Now the state has a dilemma in front of it. It can either do nothing, in which case the protest is successful, they've stopped traffic, they may become empowered, they may reveal the weakness of the state, or the state can send in the armed forces, crack some heads, arrest a bunch of people, and in the process, the people using this method of action are sure to take a lot of pictures and disseminate the violence of the state. And the idea in the direct intervention and the dilemma action is to draw out the violence inherent in structures of power and make them material, make them direct violence, to tease out the violence of a structure, to show the unjust nature of a system of power. So direct intervention. An example I always like to give, some people in this room have probably heard this example before, but I think it's a great example for a number of reasons. In Iran in 2006, it was World Cup time, and you of course know that in Iran it's a very oppressive country. It's very weak on women's rights, and in Iran there was a famous protest during the World Cup where a group of women activists snuck into a World Cup stadium. Now, Iranians love their World Cup. They're like South Americans and Europeans in that sense. They love their football. And so it's like a national pastime almost. And this is a match in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and these women have snuck into the stadium. They're not allowed to in Iran. There's no place for women. They're forbidden to go to these sporting events which are meant for men. So as part of their movement for increased women's rights, they managed to sneak into the stadium in live broadcast World Cup event, unfurled big banners condemning the government and calling for increased women's rights. So this is in many ways these different classes of methods overlap, but I would say this would be clearly classified as direct intervention. Now, it has a communicative element. They're communicating a message, sure. It has a non-cooperative element, sure. They're not cooperating with the rule of no women in the stadium. But more importantly, it's creating a dilemma for the state. Now on national TV and viewed around the world, the state has a choice. Do nothing, look weak, empower the women's movement, or send in the police and drag them out kicking and screaming and make manifest that violence that underlies the system. At the time, the authorities decided to do nothing. They let them have their little celebration. So it made the regime look really bad. The women's movement was empowered. And what happened afterward, this was during the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. What he did then was he said, you know what? We were moved by this. We're going to change the law, and from now on, women can come to sporting events. So it was like this moment of an effective use of civil resistance changed some policy of the Iranian state, although I shouldn't really say that because it was very soon turned over by the Supreme Council of Religious Authorities, who said, no, you can't do that. They're still banned. So in the end, it wasn't effective in overturning that rule, but it sure added a lot of momentum to the women's movement. And I like this example because it shows that civil resistance can have an impact even in very oppressive countries, even in theocracies, even among women participants in a country known for being very oppressive to women. So I think it's a good example for showing how it can work even outside of the confines of a liberal society. The point of all this is that every time I think a migrant shows up at a border without proper documentation, trying to cross illegally, it's an act of direct intervention. You're creating a dilemma for the state. Now it's got to either block you by force and reveal the violence of the institution, or let you pass and potentially undermine its own authority and encourage more of the same. So I think that this is part of the hidden power of irregular migration that we can see from a civil resistance perspective that gives us a sense that I've just lost my train of thought. It gives us a sense that, well, we're all here talking about irregular migration. It's a big news issue for a reason. It's an issue that has mobilized activists for a reason. And I think that it is the actions of the people moving themselves that is doing it. It's not that the world has suddenly decided to care. It's that it's thrown in our face by the actions of these individuals. And the dynamics that we may not be aware of are actually leading to changed conversations and increased social mobilization around the issue. So I think this is something that is a key insight from civil resistance theory that can help us see maybe there's some changed dynamics at work that we might not have recognized otherwise.
So this is your graphic?
This is I made the graphic, but it comes from Gene Sharp.
Okay.
The idea of communicative protests being the lowest level of civil resistance, non-cooperation a little bit more intense, and direct intervention. That's Gene Sharp's model, but it has not been, as far as I know, it has not been applied to irregular migration.
Could you not, why do you think that the Citizenship Studies doesn't do exactly this in terms of looking at the actions of migrants or irregular crossers, or basically give agency to the people that are being excluded through their act of citizenship, right? Because the transnational or the more critical citizenship studies is basically saying that citizenship isn't a legal status, it is an act of asserting your political will in a space. And I think it's been doing this for a long time.
Well, I think that's fair, but I don't think that translates to, even though they're focusing on the people themselves, I don't think they have a way to analyze the action in this sense. And I put in my slide on citizenship, I think the exception to that is James Tully, because he does do a lot of, at the very bottom on the right, where am I here? Very bottom on the right. Oh no, I'm way at the bottom. Sorry, I went the wrong way. Here. Tully is the exception. And now, James Tully does a lot of work on citizenship, and he also will turn to the dynamics of how the action of ordinary people can, catalyze social change, catalyze conversations, catalyze action of others. But when he's doing that, he's turning to Gandhi, he's turning to Gene Sharp. So I think there's still a difference here, and this is what I tried to suggest with, even though they show that these exclusions are problematic, unfair, and even though they recognize that citizenship could be conceived in a more broad way, it remains at the level of trying to, the argument is really about changing your mind. Basically, we're going to mobilize the empirical data, we're going to mobilize ethical arguments, and we're going to say, we're going to try and persuade governments and public opinion. You should change your mind because all these reasons. And to me, that's still, you're still making an argument based on what you think the world should be. So you're trying to convince people to change their mind. You're trying to convince people to have a change of heart. Whereas civil resistance adds the action dynamic. It almost doesn't matter what the general public thinks. This carries its own change dynamic that is happening whether or not certain sectors of society want to change or not. So one of the ideas that civil resistance includes is that when change happens, it's not because a leader, a government, an institution has had a change of heart. Oh, you've convinced me of the errors of my ways, I will now reform. Usually the way it works is the structures of social power underlying the whole situation change to such an extent that the regime, the institution, the government is compelled to change. It no longer has a choice. It's been undermined. And that's something that I think comes from civil resistance studies. I haven't seen it such a kind of action analysis or mechanisms of social change from citizenship studies.
So it shifts the agency of changing the way the border functions or the way people are excluded away from the state to the actions of the people.
I've thought a lot about this question of agency. And certainly migration studies, citizenship studies are very interested in agency. They do look to the agency of the people moving. But I think that they don't look as much to the action and the consequences, the impacts of action on the politics broadly. I think that's lacking.
Is there an issue of leadership or at least the diversity of stakeholders? And I'm thinking about, very specific cases, but I'm thinking theoretically what you say is really interesting, right? But what are the unifying vector for instance, direct intervention that works? Even if we think about Yellow Vest, if we think about the Latin American or the South American caravans going across different states and coming from Honduras across Mexico onto the US. For those to be successful direct intervention or even non-cooperation, they would need to have support on the US side that would be sizable, right, or unifying factors. And as long as they're individual actions, so the caravans in themselves is a construction that federates this, it's a unifying factor to a certain extent. But when it's, let's say, even 200,000 single migrants going across just because they're going across by small groups, is that an act of civil resistance according to you? How does it work?
Excellent questions. There's no one size fits all recipe or analysis for what constitutes a movement or a strategy or a tactic that will work, because there's just too many contingencies. But a few interesting points in there. One of the emphases of civil resistance studies is it's all about the power of numbers, people power. If you need significant numbers of people participating, and it's almost the more people you have participating in a movement, the stronger it'll be. Very commonsensical, right? If you have 3 people trying to change the world with a protest, nothing's going to happen. But one of the things that the studies find in terms of the movements that do work, that do overturn oppressive regimes or end foreign occupation, and there's not a long list of movements that have ended foreign occupation, but there are a few that have done it through primarily nonviolent struggle. What you find is that numbers are key, and that analysts look for certain thresholds of the population. And I can't remember the number, but in the studies that have been done, it was postulated some ridiculously low percent of the population, like 1.5% or something, was correlated with movements that were successful. And the other important thing about the efficacy of a movement being associated with the numbers of people involved is that it needs to be organized. Civil resistance emphasizes that all of these cases where it's effective, you have people coordinating. That's not happening with irregular migration. It's individuals. Maybe with the migrant caravan it is a little bit, But what I'm suggesting is, even though that is a problem for applying civil resistance to irregular migration, I think if we consider it at the global level and the amount of millions of people involved, there might just be enough individuals making kind of a macro difference. And it's also important that the encounter with the border is observed or publicized or captured in some way, because if a migrant just manages to sneak through in the middle of the night and no one ever knows, that's going to actually be outside of these dynamics that I'm talking about, because it has to be visible to have that impact. There needs to ideally a photo, a press release, a story. This happened at the border, this person was shot, this person was denied, and they go back and they tell their story, and the story of the violence of the border kind of circulates and contributes to a gradual shift in public opinion. So the idea would be that you would need to make significant shifts in the structures of social power of, say, the United States to get the support of, to get enough academics or enough civil society organizations talking about it, where now you can just sort of change public opinion enough to compel a government to make meaningful reform. So it may be a bit of a stretch to apply civil resistance to the phenomena of irregular migration, but I think that we can see, for example, I don't have that picture here, but a few weeks ago or maybe a couple months ago, famous picture of a woman with her little child, and they're running from tear gas, and it looks like something from the Middle East, but it's the US-Mexican border. This was on all the news outlets, and it's that kind of a moment that can really kind of shift perceptions, an open space for political change. And we all are aware of the power of that kind of the viral image, whether it's, remember that young Syrian boy who washed up on the beach in 2015 and really opened a lot of space and openness for a society to consider, oh gee, we better do something. We should maybe mobilize our country to take in more refugees. So that kind of thing can have a big impact, and it's true for civil resistance as well. Think of famous photos of, in the civil rights movement, the photos of police dogs attacking African American protesters. There's in the Arab Spring, there were all kinds of iconic photos of protesters who were praying in the street collectively being hosed by water cannons, or images like that that really stimulate the imagination, that have a big impact. So if it's not detected and it doesn't cause that moment of friction, it really falls outside of what I'm talking about. And the fact that these people aren't organizing in a movement globally may suggest the limits of the application of the theory.
On the other hand, you could look at very specific border lands and look at the reaction of both states. And I'm thinking actually right now about Venezuela, Colombia. Because Venezuela has let people go, Colombia is a country also where a lot of people in Colombia have lived in the borders of Colombia. At one point there was 5 million displaced people, in different places around Colombia. But today there are thousands of people who cross the border daily, and there are reports that come from all kinds of places. News media agencies and so on and so forth about that very specific issue right now. And I'm thinking, the catalyst factor, like the organizing factor, I think is a really interesting one, because maybe it's a way for you to actually drive your study and to test whether there is such a thing, and to write on it, because that would be really interesting. I find it really bizarre that, for instance, in the Palestinian-Israeli case, you have had hundreds of deaths, you've had a repeated manifestation, right? Strike, basically, and the results are very, very small in a way, the impact. And I know the US is in the balance and is really supporting Israel against an election and so on and so forth. But here you wonder how well organized it is, or why is it that there is no impact? I mean, there are, if not 100, at least a few hundred.
You mean at the Gaza fence?
Yeah.
Killed.
There are a few hundred non-profit organizations that work in Gaza and work between Israel and Gaza. They have tremendous impact worldwide. They can influence Israeli politics, and it's not gone anywhere. And I'm thinking, this could also be tested in Turkey, for instance. You could look at Syria-Turkey relations. You could look at, and there are people who do research on this. You could look at Turkey-Greece, for instance, as well. And for instance, the pushback in Europe in certain countries, I find quite fascinating, right? For instance, in Germany, the pushback was on the left of the political spectrum, even though there was a post-pushback, right? But the policy that really inspired was led by Merkel when she said, "This is not the Germany this is not my Germany." Publicly, everybody basically aligned with her, and then in certain lands, some of the most nationalist or xenophobic parties, were able to benefit from this. But overall, the country basically swallowed 900,000 people in a few months. And you can complain about everything, but they still did swallow that kind of population in a few months. And there was a backlash, a post-welcome backlash in a way. But Germany is still very progressive when you look at the negotiation at the EU level. I mean, they basically stand their ground. They have moved a little bit, but they stand their ground. Whereas countries like France under Macron, who labeled himself as very progressive, have not been able to move very much because they basically, the politics is cornered by Le Pen and Mélenchon, the extreme right and the extreme left, basically. There are other countries that I find quite interesting, like Spain, for instance, that has these really strong border walls, right? But at the same time, it's a country that has recently helped lots of people lost at sea and has allowed for non-profit boats to actually, when they were refused in Italy, they could come on the other side and go to, different harbors on the Spanish side. And so I think it's kind of interesting to pose the question, but also to see at some of these non-profits and some of these other policymakers have the ability to basically move in these changing policy environments as a way to test whether the idea that, crossing the border illegally can basically a political act that is either of protest or non-cooperation or direct intervention. Even France, for instance, has basically managed to close. There used to be a group in France, Nicole, do you remember their name? The boat that they had?
Oh, no.
There was a group that used to be able to come to Marseille with a fairly large boat, and they saved thousands of lives. And the French government found a way to refuse them to harbor. They can't come to harbor anymore in France in any of the ports. And so, they basically you can see that these. It's not successful in the same way everywhere, but I'm thinking, even if we were to take non-cooperation and direct intervention, or the two other ones, to test them in border regions and we could do this on either the borderland, so right to harbor or right to transit, like the ability to go across, right? So you could look at, for instance, the northern Italians, you go in Val d'Aoste, and you go to the Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur region, which is the 3-4 valleys that are kind of, and you look at the networks there, they are defined, they're non-cooperation, they don't do direct intervention, although they have been direct. But the non-cooperation is literally networking throughout all of the municipalities, all of the elected officials, all of the non-profits. The tourism industry is involved in hosting, illegal migrants. They move them with delivery trucks. I mean, it's amazing. It's completely organized. The state can't do anything, you know. So, I mean, I know of this because I follow obviously what's going on, but I'm thinking in some of those regions, you could really test this and write on this because the framework is there.
I've been trying to think about how do you make some sort of empirical research plan to advance this, and I was thinking as well that you've got to go to a borderland,
Yep.
start looking at incidents, press coverage, public opinion, discourse overall, maybe before and after certain benchmarks. But yeah, and I was thinking even the border right at San Diego is probably a good sort of place to do that. But
Not just San Diego, El Paso is really good.
yeah,
I wouldn't go on the other side to Brown, you know, to
Forest,
Brownsville. Is it called Brownville?
Forest, on the other side of El Paso?
No, I go on
Texas.
the other side
Oh.
of the border, on the other side of the border line, the boundary line on the Texas side. But if you look at El Paso, if you look at Tijuana, if you look, I mean, there are a number of places, Nogales, for instance, you could look at these different places. And look, I mean, there are lots of colleagues who could help you collect lots of information from, you know, these different groups to look at how it works.
yeah, thinking about a research design is something that would be great if I can make some progress on soon. Yes.
In 1971, East Pakistan, there was a massive backlash against the Pakistani army, which was trying to suppress a liberation movement which had started in in East Pakistan then. It was part of Pakistan. As a result of that, more than 1 million people migrated into the eastern wing and the western wing, which was India. And incidentally, I used to stay in Calcutta those days. The Indian government arranged for massive refugee tents and all that, accommodated them. The local people supported them. In fact, I was in college that time, and you know, we did a sort of a shoe polish and collected money also for those people. So, but that could be something that you could study, how that was handled by the Indian government, and then of course the Indian government went in and supported that movement, and the rest is history. It broke away from Pakistan, became Bangladesh. But there was nearly an year's, you know, a period of 1 year when 1 million refugees had come here. We had to accommodate, and many then sneaked in and remained in India. So that is an episode where probably you could study from the perspective of short-term accommodation by another country of a group of people who are fighting for something, and then they come and take refuge. That is 1971.
Today
Yeah.
it's,
Bangladesh.
Yeah, like today that border is.
Oh, that now there's another kind of a problem. There's a Hindu-Muslim issue going on.
And I wanted to come back too with what you said about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You know, I wrote a book about Palestinian civil resistance against Israel, and the misconception is, well, it doesn't work. It hasn't worked. Why hasn't it worked? And I guess an important point is even the strongest proponents of civil resistance don't try to say that it's a silver bullet or a magic cure. It's no guarantee of success for a movement. They're just saying it's more effective than armed struggle. And I think the Palestinian case bears this out. If you look at, to take Gaza as an example, every time militants in Gaza are firing rockets into Israel, it's a great PR day for Israel. They're quite happy to show the images of Israelis running into bomb shelters and to paint Hamas as this violent organization. But they're not at all happy about the popular protests on the border. They're very keen to stop that because that image It does a lot in terms of galvanizing, I think, public events and civil society support for Palestinians when you see these repeated popular protests of people putting their, confronting the militarized fence with basically their body. There's some violence. Some groups are throwing stones. Sometimes they're burning things, or they're trying to cut the fence sometimes. So a lot of conventional theorists of civil resistance would say, that's not civil resistance, it's violent. This is where I think that distinction between, okay, maybe there are elements of violence in it, but the dynamics of an unarmed, non-militarized people, even if it's a bit rowdy, is still functioning in a way very similar to civil resistance. So it's the crucial distinction for me is not, is it perfectly nonviolent versus some element of violence? It's more about the disparity between the violence of the minimal violence, protest violence of demonstrations compared to the harsh violence of the state, and that the crucial line that gets crossed is once you militarize a struggle, now you're in a different landscape of dynamics.
So they, yeah.
Okay, we're just about done here. To recap this.
Just in time for your hour and 50 minutes. Michael and I had a joke earlier about how long he was going to talk for, but we've been derailing you the whole time. I have something else. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so we might just breeze through this, but I have thought about a few examples of cases where civil resistance has actually been relatively effective against or across borders. And this is something that, first of all, people are skeptical about civil resistance, even in the domestic context, if you're dealing with an oppressive, undemocratic regime. But they're very skeptical about whether or not it can have any international ramifications. And I think one of the things I study in my book, and I went to the West Bank to document and figure out, was how popular committees against the Israeli separation barrier managed to actually thwart the wall in many locations. I shouldn't say many, in some locations. These grassroots organizations did not succeed in dismantling the Israeli separation barrier in the West Bank, but in a number of localized communities, they managed to push it back off their land, restore all sorts of livelihood to communities. And it didn't receive a lot of press attention, but I document a number of cases. So what I would call this is scattered small cases of civil resistance working even against what we could call a border wall, in terms of generating enough social pressure to eventually compel the army to dismantle the thing and push it back, in some cases off of Palestinian land and back to the Green Line, which is Israel's internationally recognized boundary. There's also some big cases that everyone will be familiar with. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell peacefully, and that whole process was initiated by mass popular protests. It caught everybody by surprise, from the specialists to the statesmen. Another interesting example, during the first half of the 20th century, Jewish migration to Palestine as part of the Zionist project, mostly Jews fleeing persecution in Europe and looking for a homeland, were trying to move to establish their own state, so the Jews could have one state that could protect them. And at the time, Britain controlled the country, and even though Britain, for the most part, cooperated with and facilitated Jewish immigration into Palestine and really helped make what became Israel possible, there were times, particularly in the last 10 years of British control of the country, where they severely restricted Jewish immigration and sometimes shut it out altogether. Even during World War II, and especially in the aftermath of World War II, the 3 years after World War II, when the horrors of the Holocaust became known, when there were hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees scattered across Europe, Britain still closed the gates. So what the Jewish migration, which was known as Aliyah, the process of migrating to the Holy Land, went underground, and they called it Aliyah Bet, or Aliyah B, like Plan B. And they were, sneaking ships trying to break the British blockade. Jewish tourists would just overstay their visa, all sorts of things that eventually managed to, it didn't single-handedly lead to the Britain leaving or in the creation of Israel, but Aliyah B, the exploits of these teams and campaigns of Jews to break the blockade and to get into the Holy Land across the British boundary were very much a part of the discourse and the spirit of the time, contributing to popular support for the Jewish struggle. So I put that in there, and I'd also briefly mention the Underground Railroad as a big example of movement for increased political rights that involved, and in some cases necessitating, crossing that boundary line to get into Canada. The point here is that in each case, groups of people use civil resistance against or across borders to generate greater civic freedom, and it was often done in contravention of prevailing expectations. Okay, let's wrap this up. In conclusion, I'm trying to say that social science, common social science research in this area, specifically migration, borders, and citizenship studies, reveal the iniquities of global migrant challenges. And they often lead to calls for maybe we ought to change this. We ought to have more migrant rights. But it still seems to me largely stuck on the ought side of that is-ought divide. They don't really have a way of analyzing how is this going to happen given public opinion and political atmosphere of the time. Whereas civil resistance theory, well, first off, civil resistance theory is more about is than ought. They always try to stress in how they frame their analysis and their research, we're looking at what is, not what ought to be, and my suggestion that it can be applied to irregular migration. And I think that civil resistance theory highlights the action dynamics and change mechanisms that are already underway today. And to the extent that they will grow and ultimately drive what might be more progressive change is uncertain. We'll have to see what happens. So I have some sources. All right, time for a question and answer.
What do you think about this European citizenship? You know, it's a transnational citizenship based on the national identity, who gave you the right to vote in other country, to be elected in other country, to be protected by the national agency.
Travel,
so it's a
cross-border.
So it's a transnational citizenship with.
I think the EU is a commonly cited example in citizenship studies of how it is possible to reconceptualize and reformulate citizenship away from the strictly territorial nation state. I think the EU is a good source of looking at the question of how citizenship is more malleable than we tend to think.
Do you think it's retreating in the era of the increased flows of people?
I think it appears to be retreating. I think even people who advocate for increased migrant rights are backing off that claim, not because they've changed their mind, but because they're looking at the consequences of populism on the right. And so you get even, what was Hillary Clinton's famous comment a little while ago where she says, Europe's taken enough refugees, because they're looking at the rise of right-wing parties and saying, okay, we better back off. So it does look like we're in a dark time, and this discussion or this argument that I'm putting together is completely at odds and against the grain of what appear to be the political trends of the time, political opinion, public opinion. But I would say that usually when there are significant changes to when new groups achieve rights or when there's a progressive change, it often comes right when most people think it wouldn't happen. Look at the peaceful end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nobody thought that would happen. IR scholars were saying in the 1980s, this Cold War is going to go forever until one side annihilates the other. Apartheid in South Africa, people right up to the very end were resistant that this could ever actually end peacefully. So I would say we shouldn't be too daunted by the seemingly depressing political climate we're in, and maybe there's stuff happening below the surface that could lead to a sort of a tipping point, cascade sea change. Did I just detect a comment or a question over here?
Oh, many. But as I'm hearing this, it makes me think a couple of things. One is back to the comment on Spain and how it had at some point welcomed migrants basically for a humanitarian response to the tragedy of people dying at sea. And yet Vox, the far right wing, there hadn't been a right wing party, an extreme right party in Spain since 1978, and it's rised in the last 3 years in a very significant manner. So to me that points to that need for solidarity. So
Yes.
for civil resistance to be effective, it has to trigger a level of solidarity that's nowhere in Europe. So yes, it may happen at one level when Germany or Sweden open their doors to migrants, but the reaction is very drastic. And it didn't happen when Greece wanted to change their conditions within the EU, and I'm talking about something completely different, but that was what I would say, what I will qualify state civil resistance to European imposed financial terms. And so the big challenge here to me is that when all the problems with irregular migration, we're not talking about the opposition from border states, but from a much broader challenge, which is the offshoring of economic inequality. So that transcends national policies, transcends Schengen, it transcends any solidarity within the states, because the states have no ability to change that supranational neoliberal order that requires Europe to remain Europe, the United States, Canada, the privileged North to remain whole and prevent migration. And that's, I don't see any kind of civil resistance overcoming that, because there's not enough solidarity and enough strength or organization on the side of irregular migrants. So how do they confront not the border system just an expression of the social economic status of the countries that may be receiving migrants. So how do the irregular migrants individually confront that reality?
That's a really good question. I don't have an answer. But one of the things that strikes me from your comments is the real conundrum that this potential or latent movement is facing, when really their opponent, the opponent to increased migration rights, the opponent to really dealing with this problem of irregular migration, is not actually the states, but the public opinion within states. In many cases, the states would be happy to, but the states are looking to what their public is and worrying about the next election in determining their policy. So in some ways, it's not the state policy that is the challenge that needs to be targeted, but it's the public opinion of countries that is driving the policies of the states and their exclusionary policies. So in some ways, public opinion is the target of the resistance.
And public opinion, we've seen with Brexit, with Trump.
Public opinion
with
is going the
Bolsonaro,
opposite direction.
Is going in the direction that's opposite, precisely because of the potential financial implications.
The fears of potential.
Yeah, the middle class has a level of tolerance for suffering that triggers that solidarity, up to a point where the pension plans are touched. I mean, we see it at UVic with the investments that we make as an organization. And I've talked to people who say, I don't care what my pension plan's invested in, as long as it's financially beneficial. To me, that's the conundrum. It's how the finance rules that overrule states. Greece Italy, Spain, they're Mediterranean countries that have wanted to, the populations have wanted to be helpful with migrants. Frontex has given rise to slave markets in Libya, which, sure, we intervened in Libya to help the local population, and the outcome has been what it is now. But it's how those popular opinions are impacted by the economies of the countries, and how eventually, when the economy doesn't go very well, then there's the rise of the extreme right and the extreme left that doesn't create a context for that kind of solidarity that in the past has worked with civil resistance movements.
Yeah, I think economic uncertainty, even among the middle classes, is so key to this, as people see the direction that neoliberal policies are taking their communities, and I think there's a real when people don't feel secure, when people don't feel okay, they're more likely to lean towards xenophobia or scapegoat the people who look differently or the people who are just arriving in the community. But very often I think that that's a misdirection of their concerns. Yeah.
So one question, how do you see climate change and climate migrants or refugees
Really good.
acting on this?
You
Really-
should have been here 2 weeks ago.
Really good question. Let me just say about that is that there's an important question is, are these unprecedented levels of irregular migration likely to go down, or are they likely to go up? And at the current level, we're already having this conversation. What if they go up significantly? Then I think all these dynamics actually increase. And it's likely that you could put your money on climate change leading to exponential growth in the numbers that we're seeing now.
And exponential growth in the investment to keep our borders safe.
Yeah, Thomas Oberlin, Omer Dixon, that's what he argues. is
Who?
that they thought, you know,
Homer Dixon.
Omer Dixon.
Oh, yeah.
The paper he gave in Global Studies basically says that there is a threshold. It's like a cliff, and then suddenly, so he says that we are actually, I mean, that's what I understood in his paper, is that we are reaching a cliff because of climate change. At one point, it may be quite mad.
He scares the crap out of me. I don't like, he had a very undemocratic sort of, this is going to need to be a top-down, we're going to need to summon the courage, states are going to need to override the will of people, and it just sounded like a recipe for disaster to me. I think he's right about the problem, but the solution he's
Recommendations
suggesting.
by academics are recommendations by academics, but the
The
data.
data,
is
yeah,
interesting.
yes.
But I think one of the things on climate change is that if we know that climate change is going to displace people, and this category of irregular migrants is proving problematic for states, there's a very easy way to change that, and that's in how states implement border and immigration policy, right? So that there isn't this category, to lessen the category of irregular migrants, knowing that migrants are no longer refugees or voluntary, right? There's no longer this like dichotomy between refugees and economic migrants. The pool of economic migrants is being driven by all sorts of factors, including climate change. And until we kind of understand that we can't, that binary doesn't work anymore in terms of our migration policies, which are implemented at the border often, then states and borders are going to have a really hard time with people moving in and across and around their borders.
Guys, thank you for letting me talk through all of these ideas.